Next June is the 100th anniversary of the United Church of Canada. And I wanted to take one Sunday a month to look at a decade in the life of our church. As far as I know, we have only one person in our congregation who was alive at the time of union, and that's Mary McCallum. She was about 2 months old when the United Church was formed. Each month, I want to give you a glimpse of the decade by looking at four things: what was calling the church to action, one publication they wanted the church to read at the time, our connections with Indigenous people and communities, and then we're going to sing a hymn from each decade. So by the time June comes around, you'll know a lot more about the history of this national church, and we will have sung 100 years' worth of hymns. June 10th, 1925, three of the largest Canadian Protestant denominations came together to unite and form this church: the Methodists, the Congregationalists, and the majority of the Presbyterians. But we need to be aware of the context in which this church came into being. The world had just been through a pandemic of the Spanish flu. It killed 50 million people globally and 50,000 Canadians. We'd also just come out of a horrific war in which 66,000 Canadians were killed and more than 50 million killed or wounded globally. The manufacture and sale of alcohol in Canada had been illegal. Prohibition was coming to an end in Canada, but was ramping up in the US to the south. Women had just been granted the right to vote. Not all women, but a significant portion of the population. Racial tensions were high, and the Ku Klux Klan had a strong presence in the four western provinces. During this decade, new immigrants were coming and were eager to integrate. But there was a shortage of housing and jobs, and in 1929, the stock market crashed. So the whole era was a time of social, economic, and global turmoil. The publication the United Church wanted its people to read was a new magazine that was born with the church. This is Volume 1, Number 1, The New Outlook. It later changed to be called The Observer and is now Broadview magazine. It's the oldest magazine in Canada. It's been around for 100 years. That publication talked about the mission and the work that the three churches brought to the Union. It wasn't starting from nothing. They had 1,773 missionaries and assistants in Canada and worldwide. They ran hospitals, schools, social centers, and things called preventative homes and redemptive homes, which I'm guessing were homes for troubled boys and wayward girls, or something like that. They had tent services, spiritual conferences, Christian education, promotion of good citizenship. They had campaigns for film censorship. Film was brand new in the 20s. Political purity, whatever that is, and it has not been achieved yet. And gambling, against gambling and habit-forming drugs. And even though prohibition was ending in Canada, the new United Church continued to advocate for temperance, self-restraint with alcohol. Abstinence was preferable. The church had a wide campaign to get individuals and communities to sign the pledge not to drink alcohol in their lifetime. And you will notice even to this day, we are one of the few churches that reliably shares communion with grape juice rather than alcoholic wine. The New United Church inherited a number of mission boats from its member churches. On both coasts, these boats served indigenous and isolated communities. Here's an excerpt from a log of a mission boat on the Pacific coast. Brought sick child and woman to hospital. Spent 3 days dragging for drowned man. Several boats searching. Rushed little girl with hand partly chopped off to hospital. Towed logger's donkey and float 35 miles. Rescued 4 men from burning gas boat in Johnson Strait. Salvaged a fisherman's boat badly damaged and saved the man. Provided a real Christmas dinner for 6 families, the first they had had in over 2 years. Distributed warm clothing for little children and indigent families. And the new church also inherited a number of industrial schools that were a precursor to the Indian residential schools. This picture is from the Red Deer Industrial School in Alberta. It was only open for 20 years, but was one of the most deadly of the residential schools. Run by government and staffed in partnership with the churches, industrial schools were designed to give Indigenous children a trade, like carpentry, shoemaking, or blacksmithing. But teachers were usually underpaid, unqualified, and equipment was not made available. So the boys were mostly used for long hours of farm labor, and the girls trained to be domestic help. The school was always short of money, food, and fuel for heat. Poor ventilation and heating, along with the crowded dormitories, allowed tuberculosis to thrive. One principal at the turn of the century was stunned by the state of this school and its children, and he wrote, "A glance at the buildings and the sight of the ragged, unkempt, and sickly-looking children was sufficient to make me sick at heart." Besieged by poverty, hunger, Spanish flu, smallpox, and tuberculosis, between the adults and the children, there were not enough well people to look after the sick and dying people. The school closed in 1919, but the United Church inherited its legacy and participated in the Indian residential school system for decades more. Following the stock market crash came the 30s and years of dust storms, resulting from agricultural practices that were not suited to the prairies. Years of crop failures and grasshopper infestations led to widespread rural poverty and hunger. But the hunger was not just in rural areas. This is a hunger march in the city of Edmonton in 1932. Access to food was a huge issue. The United Church organized 23,682 bales of clothing and 2,163 carloads of fruit and vegetables to be sent to the hungry and desperate people of Northern Ontario and the prairie provinces that had seen successive crop failures. Having a national church meant that congregations in fruit-growing areas like BC and Ontario, and congregations in fishing areas like the Maritimes, were able to be mobilized to come together and send food to help their fellow church people in the hurting parts of the country. This is just a tiny taste of the world into which the United Church of Canada was born. And those church people work to respond to the great needs and the longings of people of faith, to be hopeful and engaged with the world and the life God gives us. Next month, we'll look at the 30s and 40s. I'm sure it will be much quieter. The church and the war years. The hymn we're going to sing today came out of the 1930s, out of the energy and turmoil and hope that each new day can bring. And the offerings we give today and every week support not only our own church, but also the work of the whole church across Canada and around the world, as we have for 100 years. Let's stand and sing as our offerings are brought forward.